Hello Fanatics, welcome to Thriller Thursday. Today we are going to be talking about Edward Theodore Gein, known as Ed Gein. It is quite graphic in places and it's quite a disgusting story, so I'm just putting that out there. Yeah, let's begin. Ed Gein was born in La Crosse County in Wisconsin on the 27th of August 1906, the second of two boys to George and Augusta. Ed had an older brother, Henry. Augusta hated her husband. He was an alcoholic who was unable to keep a job, and he worked at various times as a carpenter, a tanner, an insurance salesman, and George owned a local grocery shop for a few years but sold the business, and then the family moved to a 155-acre farm in the town of Plainfield in Wisconsin. They lived very isolated. It was just them. It became their permanent residence, and Augusta took advantage of the farm's isolation by turning away outsiders who could have influenced her sons. Now, this is why it's important for children to interact with other children. Ed only left the farm to attend school. Outside of school, Ed spent most of his time doing chores on the farm. Augusta was very, very religious. She preached to her boys about the innate immorality of the world, the evil drinking, and her belief that all women, apart from her, every single woman, were naturally promiscuous and instruments of the devil. She reserved time every afternoon to read to them from the Bible, usually selecting verses from the Old Testament and Book of Revelation concerning death, murder, and divine retribution. You can see where he goes in his mind. Ed was shy, and classmates and teachers remembered him as having strange mannerisms, seemingly random laughter, as if he were laughing at his own personal jokes. To make matters worse, Augusta punished him whenever he tried to make friends. Despite his poor social development, Ed did fairly well in school, particularly in reading. On the April the 1st, 1940, Ed's father George died of heart failure caused by his drinking. He was 66. Henry and Ed began doing odd jobs around the town to help cover living expenses, and the brothers were generally considered reliable and honest by residents of the community. While both worked as handymen, Ed also frequently babysat for neighbours. He enjoyed babysitting, seeming to relate more easily to children than adults. Henry began dating a divorced mother of two and planned to move in with her. He worried about his brother's attachment to their mother and often spoke ill of her around Ed, who responded with shock and hurt. On May the 16th, 1944, Henry and Ed were burning away marsh vegetation on the property. The fire got out of control, drawing the attention to the local fire department. By the end of the day, having extinguished the fire and the firefighters were gone, Ed reported his brother missing. With lanterns and flashlights, a search party began for Henry, whose dead body was found laying face down. Apparently he had been dead for some time, and it appeared that the cause of death was heart failure, since he had not been burned or injured otherwise. However, it was reported later that Henry had bruises on his head, and the police dismissed the possibility of foul play, and the coroner later officially listed asphyxiation as the cause of death. The authorities accepted the accident theory, but no official investigation was conducted, and they didn't do an autopsy. Questioning Ed about the death of Bernice Worden in 1957, State Investigator Joe brought up the questions about Henry's death. Another George who studied the case, said it was possible and likely that Henry's death was caused by Ed, because he was very defensive of his mummy. Very, very defensive of his mummy. Ed and his mother were now alone. Augusta had a paralysing stroke shortly after Henry's death, and Ed devoted himself to taking care of her. Sometime in 1945, Ed later recounted that he and his mother visited a man named Smith who lived nearby to purchase straw, and according to Ed, Augusta witnessed Smith beating a dog. A woman inside the Smith home came outside and yelled for him to stop, but Smith continued to beat the dog to death. Augusta was extremely upset by this scene, but it wasn't the fact that the man was beating this dog to death. No. She was upset at the woman who had no business being there and related to her as Smith's harlot. Augusta, she also had a second stroke soon after, and her health really deteriorated. She died on December the 29th in 1945 at the age of 67. Ed was devastated, and it's been said that he lost his one friend and one true love, and he was absolutely alone in the world, following her death. So Ed held on to the farm and earned money from odd jobs. He boarded up rooms used by his mum, including the upstairs and downstairs parlour, the living room, leaving them completely untouched, while the rest of the house became increasingly squalor. He lived in absolute squalor. But the rooms that his mum used were pristine. They were just boarded up. They were dusty but pristine. And around this time he became interested in reading stories about cannibals and stuff, all disgusting stuff. Ed was a handyman and received a farm subsidy from the federal government starting in 1951. He occasionally worked for the local road crew and crop threshing crews in the area. Sometime between 1946 and 1956, he also sold an 80-acre parcel of land that his brother Henry had owned. Wow. Okay, so now we get on to the crimes. Ooh, this is where it gets really bad. Okay. On the morning of November the 16th in 1957, Plainfield Hardware store owner Bernice Worden disappeared. A resident reported that the hardware store's truck had been driven out from the rear of the building at around 9:30 a.m. The hardware store saw few customers the entire day. Some area residents believe this was because of the deer hunting season. Bernice Warden's son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Warden, I didn't realise he was a police officer, entered the store around 5 p.m. to find the cash register open and bloodstains on the floor. Frank told investigators that Ed Gein had been in the store that evening before his mother's disappearance, and that he would return the next morning for a gallon of antifreeze. A sales slip for a gallon of antifreeze was the last receipt written by Bernice on the morning she disappeared. On the evening of the same day, Ed was arrested at West Plainfield grocery store, and then the sheriff's department went to search the farm. A sheriff's deputy discovered Bernice's decapitated body in a shed on Ed's property, hung upside down by her legs with a crossbar at her ankles and ropes at her wrists. The torso was dressed out like a deer. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, and the mutilations were made after her death. Now I'm just going to list what they found within the house, and this is pretty gruesome. So yeah, they found whole human bones and fragments, a waste basket made of human skin covering several chair seats, skulls on bedposts, female skulls, some with the top sawn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from human torso skinned from shoulders to waist, leggings made from human leg skin, masks made from the skin of female heads, Mary Hogan's face in a paper bag, Mary Hogan's skull in a box, Bernice Warden's entire head in a burlap sack, Bernice Warden's heart in a plastic bag in front of Ed's potbelly stove, 9 lady parts in a shoebox, a young girl's dress, and the lady parts of 2 females judged to have been about 15 years old, a belt made from female human nipples, 4 noses, a pair of lips on a window shade drawstring, a lampshade made from the skin of a human face, fingernails from female fingers. These artefacts were photographed at the crime scene, laboratory, and then decently disposed of. When questioned, Ed told investigators that between 1947 and 1952 he made as many as 40 nocturnal visits to 3 local graveyards to exhume recently buried bodies while he was in a dazed-like state. On about 30 of those visits, he said he'd come out of the daze while in the cemetery. He left the grave in good order and returned home empty-handed. On the other occasions, he dug up the graves of recently buried middle-aged women he thought resembled his mother and took the bodies home, where he tanned their skins to make his paraphernalia. Ed admitted to stealing from 9 graves from local cemeteries and led investigators to their locations. Allen of the State Crime Laboratory participated in opening 3 test graves identified by Ed. The caskets were inside wooden boxes. The top boards ran crossways, not lengthwise. The tops of the boxes were about 2 feet below the surface in sandy soil. Ed had robbed the graves soon after the funerals, while the graves were not completed. The test graves were exhumed because authorities were uncertain as to whether the slight Ed was capable of single-handedly digging up a grave during a single evening. They were found as Ed described. 2 of the exhumed graves were found empty. One had a crowbar in place of the body. 1 casket was empty, and 1 casket Ed had failed to open when he lost his pry bar. He left it in the other grave, didn't he? And most of the body was gone from the 3rd grave, yet Ed returned some rings and body parts, therefore corroborating his confession. Soon after his mother's death, Ed began to create a woman's suit so that he would become his mother, to literally crawl into her skin. Ed denied having sex with the bodies he exhumed, explaining they smelled too bad. During State Crime Laboratory interrogation, Ed also admitted to the shooting death of Mary Hogan, a tavern owner missing since 1954, whose head was found in his house, but he later denied memory of the details of her death. A 16-year-old youth whose parents were friends of Ed and who attended ball games and movies with him reported that Ed kept a shrunken head in his house, which Ed described as relics from the Philippines, sent by his cousin who served on the islands during World War II. Upon investigation by the police, these were determined to be human facial skins, carefully peeled from corpses and used by Gein as masks. Ugh. This is really disgusting, guys. Ed was also considered a suspect in several other unsolved cases in Wisconsin, including the 1953 disappearance of Evelyn Hartley. She was a babysitter in the area. During questioning, there was a sheriff whose name is Art. He reportedly assaulted Ed by banging his head and face into a brick wall. As a result, Ed's confession was ruled inadmissible. The sheriff later died of heart failure at the age of 43 in 1968 before his trial. Many who knew the sheriff said he was traumatized by the horror of Ed's crimes, and this, along with the fear of having to testify, especially about assaulting him, caused his death. One of his friends said he was a victim of Ed Gein as surely as if he had butchered him. Yeah, I can't imagine being a routine police officer who is investigating a lead that the last person in the store was Ed Gein, and you pop over to go and ask him oh, did you happen to see Bernice, or do you know anything what happened to Bernice? And you walk into that house and discover the atrocity. It's making my eyes water. Like it must have affected them. And I remember watching I watch a lot of true crimes, obviously, and you know, a police officer walked in and saw a brown bag. I mean, I wouldn't have done it, seeing the atrocities around the house, but he saw a brown bag and he put his hand in to pull out whatever was in this brown bag, and it was, I think it was Mary Hogan's head or something. It was I would not have stuck my hand in there seeing everything around that house, but he did. Anyway, the trial. November 21st, 1957, Ed was arraigned on one count of first-degree murder, where he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. I mean, if anyone was insane, it's got to be this guy. Ed was diagnosed with schizophrenia and found mentally incompetent, therefore unfit to stand trial. He was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, which is now the Dodge Correctional Institution, a maximum security facility in Wisconsin, and was later transferred to to another state hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. In 1968, doctors determined that Ed was mentally able to confer with counsel and participate in his defence. So we're talking nearly 10 years later. The trial began on November the 7th, 1968. 11 years later, and lasted 1 week. A psychiatrist testified that Ed had told him that he did not know whether the killing of Bernice Worden was intentional or accidental. I mean, come on, guys. This guy... Gein had told him that while he examined a gun in Worden's store, the gun went off, killing her. Gein testified that after trying to load a bullet into the rifle, it discharged, and he had not aimed the rifle at her and did not remember anything else that happened that morning. Or he doesn't remember loading the body up and driving it to his house. I mean, this house was really, really creepy because, like, it had no electric or anything. That's why they're walking around with flashlights. Ugh. At the request of the defence, Ed's trial was held without a jury, with Judge Robert presiding. Ed was found guilty by the judge on November the 14th. A second trial dealt with Ed's sanity. After testimony by doctors for the prosecution and the defence, the judge ruled that Ed was not guilty by reason of insanity and ordered him committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Ed spent most of his life in the mental hospital. The judge wrote, due to prohibitive costs, Ed was tried for only one murder, that of Miss Worden. He also admitted to killing Mary Hogan. Ed Gein's house and 195-acre property were appraised at it's the equivalent of $42,000 in 2019, but it was $4,700 back then. His possessions were scheduled to be auctioned on the 30th of March 1958, amidst rumours that the house and the land it stood on might become a tourist attraction. Early on the morning of March the 20th, the house was mysteriously destroyed by a fire. No one knew how that happened. A deputy fire marshal reported that a garbage fire had been set 75 feet from the house by a cleaning crew that were given the task of disposing of refuse rather than further, that hot coals were recovered from the spot of the bonfire, and the fire from the bonfire's location did not travel along the ground to the house. So basically, it wasn't the bonfire, but it was arson. Arson was suspected, but the cause of the fire was never officially determined. It's possible that the fire was not dealt with as a matter of urgency, as the fire chief was Frank Warden, the son of Bernice, his victim. When Ed learned of the incident while in detention, he shrugged and said, "Just as well." I didn't realise that it was so he was a fireman, not a police officer, Frank Warden. So they couldn't sell any of the property. They couldn't sell the house. Or it become a tourist attraction. Because I'm very much into true crime, but would I really want to go and see Ed Gein's house? No, thank you. But his 1949 Ford sedan, which he used to haul the bodies to his victims, was sold at public auction for $760, which is the equivalent to $6,700 in 2019. It was sold to a sideshow operator, and he charged carnival goers 25 cents admission to see it. So it amazes me. Right. Ed died at the Mendota Mental Health Institute due to respiratory failure secondary to lung cancer on July the 26th, 1984, at the age of 77. Over the years, souvenir seekers chipped pieces of his gravestone at the Plainfield Cemetery until the stone itself was stolen in 2000. It was recovered in June 2021 near Seattle and placed under storage at the County Sheriff's Department. The grave itself is now unmarked but not unknown. Gein was placed between his parents and his brother in the cemetery. And because of his horrific crimes, he has become like a real fictional dream for these filmmakers and everything. And it's been said that the story of Ed Gein has had a lasting effect on American popular culture, as evident by numerous appearances in film, music and literature. The first tale came to widespread public attention in the fictionalized version presented by Robert Bloch in his 1959 suspense novel Psycho, in addition to Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 film of the same name. Gein's story was loosely adapted into numerous films, including Deranged in 1974, In the Light of the Moon 2000, Ed Gein, The Butcher of Plainfield 2007, and Rob Zombie films House of a Thousand Corpses and its sequel The Devil's Rejects. Ed served as the inspiration for a myriad of fictional serial killers, notably Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, and the character Dr. Oliver Thredson in the TV series American Horror Story Asylum. So he is in lots and lots of films, and he's widely talked about. American filmmaker Errol Morris and German filmmaker, I don't know how to say that, Werner Herzog, attempted unsuccessfully to collaborate in a film project about Gein from 1975 to 1976. Morris interviewed Gein several times and ended up spending a year in Plainfield interviewing dozens of locals. The pair planned to secretly exhume Gein's mother from her grave to test a theory, but never followed through on this scheme and eventually ended their collaboration. The aborted project was described in 1989 New Yorker profile of Morris. The character Patrick Bateman in the 1991 novel American Psycho and its 2000 film adaptation mistakenly attributes a quote by Edmund Kemper, he's someone else I want to look up, to Gein, saying, "You know what Ed Gein said about women? He said, when I see a pretty girl walking down the street, I think two things. One part of me wants to take her out, talk to her, be real nice and sweet and treat her right. The other part wonders what her head would look like on a stick." I think that was Edmund Kemper. In 2012, a German director wrote and directed a stage play about the case of Ed Gein called, I can't even pronounce that because it's in German, but it's cannibal and something about cannibalism, obviously. Yeah. So, there you go. That is the very gruesome story of Ed Gein. My son brought this one to my attention because of the nipple belt. So, yeah, I hope you are listening to this well after dinner and you're not tucking into a sandwich or something. It's pretty gruesome, guys. I can't even imagine what was going through his head. And clearly he was insane. I mean, not only has he exhumed these bodies and is doing all these things, he's making furniture out of skin, and it just doesn't bear thinking about it. Yeah. I have come across another article or file about Ed Gein, and you know, he's known as this infamous serial killer, and it's interesting because usually in most of my true crime stories I have found that they've suffered head injuries or there's certain characteristics. So I'm just going to go through this article. It's just interesting, I think. So, okay, he was dubbed the Butcher of Plainfield by the press. He was obviously a grave robber. We don't know if he was into necrophilia. I wouldn't have put it past him, to be honest, but we don't know that. We know that he did all of this to make a woman suit and reanimate his mum. I mean, it's insane, right? So his name is Edward Theodore Gein. He was born on the 27th of August in 1906. He was born at La Crosse County in Wisconsin. He weighed about 9 stone 8 pounds. He was 5'7". He had brown hair, blue eyes, and obviously, yeah. He was known as Ed or Eddie by the few friends that he had, and he was a Virgo. I don't know if that's of any interest. He didn't have any disabilities, but he did have a drooping eye, which, you know, he was kind of bullied for that. No known health issues, although there's no record of Ed Gein visiting hospital for his own medical needs before his committal to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in 1957. His sexual orientation is heterosexual, although as a child Ed would often imagine what it would be like to be a woman, to have female genital parts, a fascination which would continue into his adulthood. Age 12, Ed's mother caught him masturbating in the bath. To punish him, she grabbed his genitals, squeezed them, and called them the curse of a man. She was a man hater. Really was. And then she went on to have 2 sons. So he was shy, quiet, and socially awkward. Ed was punished whenever he tried to make friends. So he had weird mannerisms for which he was mocked, and a constant daydreamer who would laugh at his own thoughts. Family history. The marriage of George and Augusta was in 1900 and remained an unhappy marriage for 40 years, living in remote isolation. George was a violent alcoholic who struggled to hold down a job, whether as a tanner, carpenter, insurance salesman, or even his own grocery store, and was seen as useless and by his domineering wife Augusta. She was a strict Lutheran who abhorred drink, sexual deviance such as masturbation, and believed all women, excluding herself, were how can we say this? They were just sent down by the devil to tempt men, and she didn't believe in divorce. He had one older brother, Henry, as we know, and he was the youngest. 2 events preceded the death of Ed's beloved mother. Ed's violent father died of heart failure by alcoholism on the 1st of April 1940, and on the 16th of May 1944, his older brother Henry died of asphyxiation while stemming from a crop fire at their farm. This left Ed alone in the house with just his mother. By this point, Augusta suffered 2 strokes and was physically disabled and required daily support. She never ever showed him any affection. Now that is a sign. I think all serial killers were neglected. And he deeply craved that. And then she died on the 29th of December, as we know. Ed was unemotional at the death of his father and his brother. But when his mum died, that was a whole different story. Ed claimed that his alcoholic, violent father would repeatedly beat him about the head so hard my ears would ring. He's not known as a bedwetter. He's not known as a fire starter, although we sort of deem fire starting as arson, but he did first start fires because he was like burning the marshland around the farm. So does that count? I don't know. There's no known animal cruelty, which again is another thing. But again, he was on the farm, so did he shoot rabbits and stuff? We have no idea. No known pets, but he probably had a dog, not as a pet, but as a rat catcher. Marital status. It says single/virgin. There's no records of Ed being in a relationship, but given his, his mum, she had ensured that her sons were not exposed to the evil women, and that Ed saw his mother as his one true love, and it's unlikely that he dated or engaged in consensual sex. No partners, no children. We know in 1942, at the age of 36, Ed was just about eligible for the military draft that they did. He travelled to Milwaukee for his physical exam, but was rejected by the army owing to the growth of above his eye, which they said impaired his vision. IQ 106. Ed was assessed following his arrest to determine if he was mentally capable. He was an average student but an excellent reader, though he would often be bullied due to his speech impediment, which I seem to have right now. Favourite food. He wasn't much of a cook. His farmstead had no electricity or running water, and his cupboards contained little more than basic of canned goods, oatmeal and bread, with his main source of nutrition being potatoes and the rabbits he hunted. There you go, I called it. So, yeah. Ed did enjoy a meal at Irene and Lester Hill's home, the local store owners, of pork chops, boiled potatoes, macaroni cheese, coffee and cookies. Favourite music? Unknown. Favourite film? Unknown. Favourite book? Just prior to the death of his mother, Ed became interested in reading lurid crime stories and adventure magazines he'd get from the general store. These were seedy tales about cannibals, murderers, death cults, Nazi atrocities, with reference to grave robbing, shrunken heads, and death masks. Favourite drink? Ed did not drink alcohol because of his mum. Smoker, likewise, he didn't smoke. Hobbies? What hobbies did Ed Gein have? When he wasn't reading crime magazines, Ed entertained himself by playing the accordion and the flute. He was also a taxidermist. Really? You're going to put that in there? I can't believe they've done that. Reason for murder. Fixated on his childhood fantasy of what it would like to be a woman, Ed fashioned himself a woman's suit. I mean, most people would go and buy female clothes, but not Ed. A full body onesie from head to toe sewn from the tanned skin of various recently deceased corpses he had dug up and dissected from the local cemetery. Ed claims to have made 40 nocturnal visits, stealing from 9 graves, as well as murdering 2 women, Bernice Warden and Mary Hogan. And he chose Mary Hogan because she was very domineering and reminded him of his mum. Yeah, method of killing. He used a rifle. Number of victims. Gein confessed to killing 2 women, Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden. I mean, he killed Mary Hogan on the 8th of December 1954, and then Bernice Warden on the 16th of November 1957. There's quite a big gap in there, you know, compared to most. It's impossible to determine as Ed's career as a murderer or grave robber either started on the 16th of May 1944, when it is believed but never proved that he killed his brother, June 1947, when Ed dug up his mother's corpse. I wonder if he did that, because there's been no reference to that, has there? Because if you want to fashion a suit on your own mum, who better to do it than on your own mum? He was suspected in the disappearance of 8-year-old Georgia and 15-year-old Evelyn, but he was never charged with a criminal record. Yeah, so Deputy Sheriff Frank Warden entered his mum's store to find her missing, and then that's how they found him. He was arrested at home, although the local police had found Mary and Bernice's body as well as 9 other corpses in various states of dissection and rigor mortis. Ed didn't confess to the 2 murders until the next day. Deemed mentally incapable, Ed was spared the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison at Mendota State Hospital, where he died in 1984 suffering, well, he had lung cancer, which spurred on the respiratory failure. Type of prisoner. Ed was described in hospital as perfectly amicable and docile, who rarely required tranquilizers to keep his mood under control. So there you go, guys. That is Ed Gein. So I hope you enjoyed this Thursday's true crime story. It is New Year's Eve, so I'm going to wish you a happy new year. I hope you stay safe, and yeah, let's hope 2021 is much, much, much better than 2020. I love you guys. Thank you so much for listening. If you do enjoy my true crime stories, please check out my Thriller Thursday playlist. I have them all in there so that you can find them and listen to them. Please give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more from me. And I shall leave you with the ringing of the new year. So, thank you so much for all of your support in 2020. I really do appreciate it. I love you guys, each and every single one of you, and I shall see you very soon. Bye.